Thank you, Leah. Appreciate it. Well, this is fun. Tonight we get to talk about my favorite poet, Emily Dickinson. And she's an amazing individual who wasn't really known much for her poetry when she was alive, although she sent poems as gifts along with her flowers. She was known as a gardener. She had the most beautiful garden, they said, in Amherst. And my sweet wife, who's here now, came. We went to Amherst, and it was fun. We've been there a couple of times. It's a beautiful place, the homestead. And so it was delightful to see it in person, and we've been to her grave and so on. Dickinson was born in Amherst, in that town in Massachusetts, into a prominent family with strong ties in the neighborhood. They went back several generations. In fact, it was her grandfather that built the homestead. And it was her grandfather that built the homestead. I got to take a picture of my kids. Just a second. Anyway, I appreciate you coming. I appreciate everybody coming. The old homestead was built by her grandfather in Amherst. It's a beautiful old home that was there a long time, and the family ended up moving into it. They'd been in various homes before and moved into the family home after the grandparents passed away. And it continues to be, it was given to the, or sold, I should say, by the family in 1965 to the Amherst College, who turned it into the Emily Dickinson Home Museum, which is what it is now. And it's great. How many of you have been there? It's a fun place to go see. Yeah. At any rate, she didn't spend a whole lot of time away from her home, and that's why I start with that, because her later years were pretty much at the homestead. She did visit Boston once in a blue moon, and she went to school at Amherst, at the Amherst School for a while, where her father was the secretary for a while, and treasurer. And I brought some documents of him, Edward Dickinson, up here. He later was a congressman, United States congressman, and her longest trip away from home was going to Washington, D.C. once to visit her father. Anyway, she wasn't really that close to either of her parents, as it turns out. In fact, she said some pretty direct things about her mother. She said that she wished that she had one. They weren't very close. And her mother was quite sickly a lot of time too. And Emily's life, she had a lot of sickness too. There's been a lot of speculation as to what those were. Epilepsy seems to be one of the big ones that ran in her family, but whether that was her or not, who knows. Although a prolific writer, her only publication during her lifetime were 10 of her poems, only 2 of which she authorized being printed. So the other 8 were printed by family members. I brought a little book, in fact 2 little books tonight, that have poems in them that were published during her lifetime. So these are 2 little rare books that have a couple of her poems in them. And the others, like I say, were published by her friends, others. And that's the way she published her poems, was by putting them in letters to friends. And so that was it. But she asked her sister Lavinia, she had one sister and one brother, and she asked her younger sister Lavinia, to burn all of my correspondence, all my letters. And Lavinia did. But when she was going through her dresser after her death, which was she only lived to be 55, when she was going through her dresser, she found 1,776 poems. And they were all very neatly sewn into what she called facils, little groups. And her sister was shocked. She knew she'd written some poems, but she had no idea there were nearly 1,800 poems. And as she read them, she thought, oh, these shouldn't be destroyed. So unfortunately, we lost a lot of her letters. But there were enough letters. There are still 1,000 letters that have shown up. And the letters were published in 1894. This is the first printing of them. They have the little daffodils on the front of her early books. She loved daffodils. She loved a lot of flowers. But these were done. This was done in 1894, and it was done by edited by Mabel Loomis Todd, with a little picture that we've. So this is 1894 of her, and Todd is an interesting lady because she and Emily never met, although she was her brother's paramour, and Emily was very close to her sister-in-law, who she felt like she was quite angry, this lady, but during her lifetime she never went out of her way to meet her, even when she came to their home. Their home, her brother's home, was only a few hundred yards away, for those of you that have been there to Amherst. At any rate, it was the family relations were strained in many directions, but she loved her nieces and nephews, and it was their deaths more than anybody's that caused her to dwell a lot on death and the afterlife and so on. And you got to remember too that the great body of her letters, almost 900 of them, were written during the time of the Civil War. So from 61 to 1865 was her most prolific time. So well over half of her lifetime poems that we have were written during that terrible conflict, and that might explain why there's so many of them that refer to death and the afterlife and things like that. But they do it in a very interesting way, most of them, because he often used slant rhyme as well as unconventional capitalization and punctuation. In fact, those few 10 that were published during her lifetime, none of them were published correctly the way she had them. She used hyphens or dashes throughout her poetry, and that was just not to be had by the editors at the time. So they took all that stuff out, which changed the meaning of a lot of them. Any rate, that was kind of the overbite of her poetry, was that it was all found after her death, basically, except for those that were sent in letters to others. I've got a great example of that here. I think you can probably see the daffodils in this letter. This is an original. And this is a little poem she sent to a friend. She just signs it Emily. We've got our daughter Emily here tonight, so she wanted to come. She's partially named after her. So, at any rate, this is she dwelleth in the ground where daffodils abide. Her maker, her metropolis, the universe her maid. To fetch her light and hue and fairness and renown, the firmaments to pluck her and fetch her here be mine. Emily. Anyway, you need somebody to study it out to figure out all of it. But obviously that was sent with some flowers, and she was known mostly as a gardener during her lifetime. She loved her garden. In fact, she made it a point that when they, and of course many of you know that she became the lady in white because she wanted, towards the end of her life, she would wear colorful dresses and things earlier on, but later in her life, she liked to wear white, and so she did. There's only one white dress we know of for sure that exists. It's in the library at Harvard College now. It gets pulled out occasionally, and they have reproductions at her home and so of them. But when she died, she wanted a white casket, which they prepared for her, and she wanted her favorite flowers put in the casket with her body, which they were, and she wanted to be carried through the garden to the graveyard. If you know where that is, it's just very close by, and So she always thought that was a solemn place, but after her burial, they started planting flowers and doing other things around it in her honor. Well, like I say, she was actually born in 1830, which is kind of an important year for Latter-day Saints. And she was born at the end of that year, December 10th. It was a prominent but not a wealthy family, the Dickinsons, but they were very prominent. And her father, being a lawyer and trustee of Amherst College, was also the secretary, as I mentioned. And Emily's paternal grandfather, Samuel Dickinson, was one of the founders of Amherst College. He's the one that built the homestead, which was built, incidentally, in 1813. So she wasn't born until 1830. Anyway, it was on the town's main street, and it became the focus of the Dickinson family for the better part of the next century. Samuel Dickinson's eldest son, Edward, was the treasurer. That was her father of the college. And he was a member of the Massachusetts Senate in 1842-43, and then represented Massachusetts in the 10th Congressional District of the 33rd U.S. Congress from 1853 to 55, which is during that time she visited her father once. He had married Emily Norcross, her mother, and they had the 3 children. Austin was the oldest, the son. William Austin was named. Emily's real name is Emily Elizabeth Dickinson. So we usually leave her middle name off, but that was her real name, was Emily Elizabeth. And then her younger sister, who looked up to her quite a bit, was Lavinia Norcross, and she's the one that burned the letters but saved all the poetry. Otherwise, we wouldn't know about her sister's work. By all accounts, there aren't very many. Young Emily was a very well-behaved girl. Dickinson's aunt, Lavinia, described her as, quote, perfectly well and contented. She's a very good child, but with little trouble. Dickinson's aunt also noted the girl's affinity for music and her particular talent for playing the piano. She loved the piano. And she called her, I guess Emily used the word music. So when she was young, that was the word that she used for that. Dickinson consistently described her father warmly. Her correspondence suggests that her mother was regularly cold and aloof. She said once, quote, she was an awful mother, but I liked her better than none, quote unquote. So that's not a real positive thing. On September 7th, 1840, Dickinson and her sister Lavinia started together at Amherst Academy, a former boys' school that had opened to female students 2 years earlier. And she made some friends there that became lifetime friends. Any rate, during her teenage years, she had quite a few of her family members that passed away. She was troubled from a young age by the deepening menace of death, especially the deaths of those who were very close to her. I brought one letter tonight that I've got 2 letters in our collection and one poem, the poem I've shared with you. This letter is actually 3 pages long. It's written to Mr. Mack, who was the wife of the postmaster. You can see her handwriting is quite delicate, but these are originals here. And in fact, this is the first time I think I've shown them for forever, so it's kind of fun to get them out. But at any rate, she had beautiful little writing, but it was very simple. Half of her work is in pencil and half in ink. This poem I read you is in ink, but the 2 letters I showed you there, or will show you, are in pencil. Any rate, in 1845, a religious revival took place in Amherst. She was 15 years old at the time. It resulted in 46 confessions of faith among Dickinson's peers. Dickinson wrote to a friend the following year, quote, I never enjoyed such perfect peace and happiness as the short time in which I felt I had found my Savior, quote unquote. She went on to say it was her, quote, greatest pleasure to commune alone with the great God and to feel that He would listen to my prayers. The experience did not last, however. Dickinson never made a formal declaration of belonging to any church. and she didn't attend services regularly after only a few years of attending. At any rate, her poem, "Some Keep the Sabbath Going to Church, I Keep It Staying at Home," is kind of a reflection. It's kind of a reflection of her thoughts on that. I'm going to read her poems just kind of intermittently here because these are some favorites that I have, and I'm sure you've got favorites. But "Success is Counted Sweetest." This was written in 1859. "By those who ne'er succeed, to comprehend a nectar requires the sorest need. No one of all the purple host who took the flag today can tell the definition so clear of victory as he, defeated, dying, on whose forbidden ear the distant strains of triumph burst agonized and clear." Magnificent. But, we never would have had it if her sister hadn't have saved it. Anyway, she went for a while after the Amherst experience. She went to Mary Lyons Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. On our mission to Boston, my wife and I went there and saw that place. It's now, it was for girls at the time, but now it's for both men and women. She stayed at the seminary for only 10 months there. And although she liked the girls at Mount Holyoke, she never made any lasting friendships at that place. Any rate, she had a friend that passed away that she wrote a letter about in 1850. This is just a quote from the letter. "Some of my friends are gone, some of my friends are sleeping the churchyard sleep, the hour of evening is sad. It was once my study hour, my master has gone to rest, and the open leaf of the book and the scholar at school alone make the tears come, and I cannot brush them away. I would not if I could, for they are the only tribute I can pay." Anyway, she had a way of writing which was amazing. And she couldn't seem to recover from the deaths of friends and relatives. That was really tough. During the 1850s, Dickinson's strongest and most affectionate relationship was with her sister-in-law, married to her brother, Susan Gilbert. That's why she hated Todd so bad, because Todd was the evil paramour that came in on that marriage. And she loved Susan Gilbert. They'd actually started out together at Amherst School together. Dickinson eventually sent her over 300 letters, more than any other correspondent over the course of their relationship. Susan was supportive of the poet, playing the role of most beloved, quote, "most beloved friend, influence, muse, and advisor," unquote, Emily's writing, whose editorial suggestions Dickinson sometimes followed. In an 1882 letter to Susan, Dickinson said, quote, "With the exception of Shakespeare, you have told me of more knowledge than anyone living." So she really loved Susan, and when Susan was offended by Todd, you can see why she took her position. Anyway, just a few things I want to share here. One of another favorite poem. This is "I'm Nobody, Who Are You?" And these are probably all pretty famous. This is 1861, so this is Civil War time. "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. To tell one's name, the lifelong June, to an admiring bog." Anyway, she had a way of using the language in such a way as had not been used really in American with Walt Whitman or anybody else. She had her own way of writing. It was interesting to me, speaking of Shakespeare, because she read a lot of Shakespeare. She read a lot of the classics that she was able to with her library. But about 20 years ago, after I was pretty heavy into collecting her stuff when I could, and almost nothing of hers ever comes up. So I mean, the items that you see here are probably the only ones in Utah, frankly, because I don't think the libraries have them. Any letters of her here, BYU or University of Utah. I worked with both of them. And I don't say that to brag, they're just I was lucked out. I was able to pick them up. Now the big problem is where are they going afterwards? So we're not going to keep them forever. I don't know. We're working on that. But in the late 1850s, the Dickinsons befriended Samuel Bowles, the owner and editor-in-chief of the Springfield Republican, and his wife Mary. And he had quite an important part. He published those two poems for her that got published in her lifetime, but he changed the punctuation, which kind of bothered her quite a bit. And then jumping ahead to 1862, again, most of her work was done during the Civil War. 900 of her 1,776 poems were done during the Civil War. In April of 1862, she met one of her great lifelong friends, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was a well-known author at the time. We don't remember him much anymore as an author other than just his friendship with Emily. But back in his day, he was a literary critic. He was a radical abolitionist, an ex-minister, wrote a lead piece for the Atlantic Monthly titled Letter to a Young Contributor, which she read. In Higginson's essay, which he urged aspiring writers to, quote, charge your style with life, quote unquote, contained practical advice for those wishing to break into print. At any rate, Dickinson may have thought about that because she responded to his letter, although she never really did print anything. Literary guidance that no one close to her could provide, Dickinson sent him a letter which read in full, Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? Taking on his quest. The mind is so near itself it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think it breathed, and had you the leisure to tell me, I would feel quick gratitude. If I make the mistake that you dared to tell me, would give me sincere honor towards you. I enclose my name, asking you, if you please, sir, to tell me what is true. That you will not betray me, it is needless to ask, since honor is its own pawn. At any rate, she didn't sign that letter. She just put her card in there, their name on it. And that's true of a lot of Emily's things. Many of them are not signed. The last piece that I remember came up for auction was not signed. It was about Santa Claus, and it was not signed. And it did very well, but it wasn't signed. But her handwriting is pretty easy to see, unless somebody's trying to forge her, I guess. At any rate, she said to Higginson, Dickinson delighted in dramatic self-characterization and mystery in her letters to Higginson. Quote, she said of herself, I am small like the wren, and my hair is bold like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guest leaves. She stressed, unquote, she stressed her solitary nature, saying her only real companions were the hills, the sundown, and her dog Carlo. She also mentioned that whereas her mother did not, quote, care for thought, her father bought her books, but begged her, quote, not to read them because he fears they joggle the mind, unquote. So she had a rather interesting relationship with her parents, you can well imagine, which caused her again to withdraw into her room. Carlo, her dog, died during this time after having provided 16 years of companionship. Dickinson never owned another dog. We can relate a little bit to that because we've had two dogs pass away over the last 32 years, 16 years each. And so we felt blessed, but we got a new one, little Daisy, and we call her Crazy Daisy. So she's a pup, but she's keeping us running. But I guess in her day, she decided the death was too hard on Carlo, losing her dog, so she never did get another one. Emily once again was responsible after the Dickinsons bought another permanent household servant along to replace her former maid that was there working for them. Emily was again responsible for the kitchen, including cooking and cleaning up, as well as the baking, at which she excelled. She was a good cook. Around this time, Dickinson's behavior began to change. This is after the Civil War, probably during the time that she quit writing poems, or didn't write very many. She did not leave the homestead unless it was absolutely necessary, and as early as 1867, she began to talk to visitors from the other side of her door rather than speaking to them face to face. A good example of this is this little note. This was the first thing of hers that I was able to get. Got it at an auction at Swan Galleries about 40 years ago. And it says, how dare a tear intrude on so sweet a cheek? Greatest of neighbors, recall the sparrows and the great logician, tenderly E. Dickinson. And she sent that with a basket of flowers. And that was the story on it. The way it was sent to a neighbor that she heard was suffering, and the neighbor's son came to her window. She was upstairs. If you've seen where her bedroom is, it had a window that overlooked Main Street. And she lowered the flowers down, through the window, down to this neighbor that got that note. Any rate, she would often leave or send over small gifts of poems with her flowers, like I say. Later, Higginson said he referred to her in the most detailed and vivid physical account that we have on record of her as, quote, a little plain woman. He finally, he asked her to come visit him, and she said, I'm not crossing the yard. If you want to see me, you'll have to come here. And so a couple years later, he did, because he was so intrigued by her unusual poetry. And they had a writing relationship at this point. Later, he referred to her in the most detailed and vivid physical account of her on record as, quote, a little plain woman with two smooth bands of reddish hair and a very plain and exquisitely clean white piqué and blue net worsted shawl. And that's the way she was described, but that's the most we have on physical description of her. Scholar Judith Farr notes that Dickinson during her lifetime, quote, was known more widely as a gardener than as a poet. Dickinson studied botany from the age of 9, and along with her sister tended the garden at Homestead. During her lifetime, she assembled a collection of pressed plants in a 66-page leather-bound herbarium. The Homestead Garden was so well known and admired locally in its time, but it has not survived. But efforts have been made to revive it in more recent years. There were ribbons of peony hedges and drifts of daffodils in season, marigolds to distraction, and butterfly utopia, quote unquote. Dickinson would often send her friend bunches of flowers with verses attached, but, quote, they valued the posies much more than the poetry. I bet they went scrambling for it later. But that was the way it was. In June 16th of 1874, while in Boston, Edward Dickinson, her father, suffered a stroke and died. When the funeral was held in the homestead's entrance hall, Dickinson stayed in her room with the door cracked open. So she didn't attend her father's funeral. Neither did she attend the memorial service on June 28th, him having been a congressman. She wrote to Higginson that her father's, quote, heart was pure and terrible, and I think no other like it exists, unquote. A year later, on June 18th, 1875, Dickinson's mother also suffered a stroke, which produced a partial lateral paralysis and impaired memory. Lamenting her mother's increasing physical as well as mental demands, Dickinson wrote that, quote, home is so far from home, quote unquote. There's been a lot of books written about her love life, but nobody knows much about it, okay? But she expresses her love in her poems. So, there must have been some that happened, maybe just in thought. But she made close friends with a friend of her father's. It was an old elderly judge. His name was Otis Phillips Lord. He was on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court from Salem, Mass. In 1872 or 73, 18 years her senior. became an acquaintance of hers. And after the death of Lord's wife in 1877, his friendship with Emily probably became a late life romance, though as their letters were destroyed, this is surmised. Dickinson's found a kindred soul in Lord, especially in terms of shared literary interests. The few letters that survive contain multiple quotations of Shakespeare work, including plays Othello, Antony, Cleopatra, Hamlet, and King Lear. In 1880, he gave her Mary Cowden Clark's Complete Concordance to Shakespeare, 1877. Dickinson wrote, quote, "While others go to church, I go to mine. For are you not my church, and have we not a hymn that no one knows but us?" Unquote. After being critically ill for several years, Judge Lord died in March 1884, 2 years before Emily did. Dickinson referred to him as, quote, "our latest lost." 2 years before this, on April 1st, 1882, Dickinson's shepherd from the little girlhood, Charles Wadsworth, who was also a dear friend, had died after a long illness. So she lost many of her friends. Although she continued to write in her last years, Dickinson stopped editing and organizing her poems. She quit doing that in her last years. She'd made the little facets that she'd sewn together, and she'd done all that earlier, mostly during the Civil War, where 900 of most of her poems were written. At any rate, she also extracted that promise from her sister to burn her papers. Lavinia, her little sister, who never married, remained at the homestead with her until her own death in 1899. But like I say, Emily died in 1886 at age 55. Well, around town, she was known as the Myth. That's what they called Emily over the years. The Myth. She lives in the house up the hill. And that was what she was pretty well known as the Myth. When Dickinson's mother died in 1882, 5 weeks later, Dickinson wrote, quote, "We were never intimate. While she was our mother, but minds in the same ground meet by tunneling, and when she became our child, the affection came." Well, she became their child and they had to take care of her, she and her sister. And that was probably the closest she ever got to her mother right before she died. The next year, Austin and Susan's third and youngest child, Gilbert, who Emily loved that child, died of typhoid. They said Emily would never leave her room until Gilbert got ill of typhoid. And then she went over and sat with him at their home, hours and hours on end until he died. As death succeeded death, Dickinson found her world upended. In the fall of 1884, she wrote, "The dyings have been too deep for me. Before I could raise my heart from one, another has come." That's that letter. The original's right there. Okay, I was happy to read this because that's one of our letters. That summer, she had seen a great darkness coming and fainted while she was baking at the kitchen. She remained unconscious late into the night, and weeks of ill health followed. On November 30th, 1885, her feebleness and other symptoms were so worrying that her brother Austin canceled a trip to Boston to stay with her. She was confined to her bed for a few months, but managed to send a final burst of letters in the spring. What is thought to be her very last letter was sent to her cousins, Louise and Frances Norcross, and simply read, "Little cousins called back." At any rate, on May 15th, 1886, after several days of worsening symptoms, Emily Dickinson died at the age of 55. Some say, the doctor at the time said she died of Bright's disease. Some say she had epilepsy. We've never figured it out, but her family she and her mother particularly, were quite ill, and her family members died around her of various sicknesses. Dickinson was buried, as I mentioned, in a white coffin with vanilla-scented heliotrope, a lady's slipper orchid, and, quote, "a knot of blue-field violets placed about it." The funeral service held in the homestead's library was simple and short. Higginson, who had met her only twice, read, quote, No Coward's Soul Is Mine, a poem by Emily Bronte that had been a favorite of Dickinson's in her lifetime. At Dickinson's request, her coffin was not driven but carried through fields of buttercups for burial in the family plot at the West Cemetery on Triangle Street. We've been to her grave. Originally, it just had a small marker, but then later, ironically, it was her sister-in-law that got the bigger stone put on there. And on the stone, it just says, "Called back, Emily," from her last letter. Despite her prolific writing, only 10 of those poems were written. But in 1890, Dickinson's friends, much like with Shakespeare, her friends that got together, published this little volume here. Again, it has the flowers on it. There were only 500 of these were printed, so it's quite rare, and I haven't shown it, I don't think, in 30 years. But this is the first collection of her poems. Like I say, they only did 500 copies of this, but almost immediately it became popular. They sold 10,000 later of that book, but that's from the first printing. And then later they put out second series, and this came out, I think, in about 4 or 6 years later, in which they showed some of her handwriting in the book, and I think this was 1896 or something. Oh no, this was 91. The other one was 96. This came out a year later. And then the third series, people couldn't get enough of her work. And to think this might have been lost, St. Kevin's, her sister Lavinia, saw the importance. This was 96 on the third series. So these were considered the kind of like Shakespeare's folios. These were Emily's folios, or series, if you want to call them. Her letters were published in what they could find of them in 1894, as I mentioned. And there was one, during her lifetime, there was a famous Dickinson family reunion while they were all still around, or most of them still around. And her father had died and her mother had died, but the rest of the Dickinson family had a Dickinson family reunion at Amherst, August 8th and 9th, 1883, and that's one of the actual reunion ribbons from that. I actually have an entire collection of her stuff that these are the best items, but I have a whole tub full of other originals that came from the family. Most of the family genealogy and letters between each other talking about those things. Posthumously, after Dickinson's death, Lavinia Dickinson, her sister, kept her promise, burned most of the poet's correspondence. Significantly, though, she left no instructions about the 40 notebooks and loose sheets gathered in a locked chest. Lavinia recognized the poem's worth and became obsessed with seeing them published. So her little sister kept her memory alive and kept her poems alive. She turned first to her brother's wife and then to Mabel Loomis Todd, his lover, for assistance. A feud ensued, with the manuscripts being divided between the Todd and Dickinson houses. And that feud saw to it that all of her poems that we knew about then were not published for another century. So some of the poems went to the Amherst Library, and about half of them went to Harvard after the relatives died. The first volume of Dickinson's poems, edited jointly by Mabel Loomis Todd and T.W. Higginson, appeared November 1890. Any rate, it was an interesting life. There's a little picture in here of the book that you can see here. The first scholarly publication didn't come until 1955. That was by Thomas H. Johnson. They brought the Johnson collection. It's right here, actually, the Johnson collection. And then the great last group that was put together was a guy by the name of Ralph W. Franklin, who was the expert at Harvard. And here's another poem of hers that I love. This is My Letter to the World. This is also Civil War, 1862. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. At any rate, beautiful poem. And then another favorite here that I'd like to try to end with. Because I could not stop for death. All these were written in the Civil War. This is 1863. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove. At recess in the ring, we passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us, the dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We passed before a house that seemed a dwelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Anyway, I hope we paid proper tribute to her tonight. She was one of my favorites, and I think Emily Dickinson's poetry really did get to the world. Millions of people have read it. They've been translated, even though it's difficult, into many languages around the world. Years ago, when I was collecting Shakespeare, I have a couple of original First Folio plays of Shakespeare. And so I was always interested in the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., because, most of the Shakespeare folios are in America. We've got more than the British have. And most of those are in the Folger Library, just a couple blocks from the U.S. Capitol building, in the Folger Library, by the Supreme Court building. Anyway, we went in there, Charlene, my wife and I, years ago. We loved the place. They had a lot of Shakespeare stuff. It was all Shakespeare. But then I picked up a little book that was looking forward to their next presentation. They were turning their museum over to a tribute to Emily Dickinson. And they said it was the very first woman that they'd ever done that for. And I thought, boy, wasn't that well earned? I would hope that Emily would know, maybe by her relatives or others, how important she's been in the lives of so many people that love her work. And I appreciate your coming. Thank you.